billionaire pushes his wife to share intimacy with another, and the consequences are devastating. What happens when love, betrayal, and manipulation collide in the most unexpected way? The scene is set in a lavish penthouse, a sanctuary in the sky where opulence has turned into a battlefield of emotions. A man, powerful, wealthy, and accustomed to getting whatever he desires, has made a decision that will haunt him for the rest of his life. He has pushed his wife, the woman he once loved, into a situation beyond anything he could have imagined, asking her to share intimate moments with another man. But what happens next is a devastating series of events that neither of them could foresee. In this video, we witness the chilling story of a billionaire who thought he could control every aspect of his life, including the people closest to him. His demand, a twisted test of trust and loyalty, begins an irreversible spiral that breaks the very foundation of their relationship. The wife, who was once a mere pawn in his game of power, begins to unravel a plan of her own, one that will flip the script entirely. It all begins with one push, one choice, and one heartbreaking consequence. At first, the billionaire seems confident in his position. The power he holds, the wealth he has built, and the control he exerts over every situation, everything in his life is neatly compartmentalized. But his demand is a step too far. He orders his wife to share her intimacy with another man as a means of asserting his dominance in a competitive bet with a rival. What he fails to realize is that she has been quietly harboring resentment, a resentment that now begins to surface in the most explosive way. Throughout the video, we watch how trust is shattered, control is lost, and the wife, once the passive partner, becomes the active force behind a revenge that will change everything. The more the billionaire tries to manipulate the situation to his advantage, the more he realizes he's losing control, not just of his wife, but of his entire world. His actions set off a chain of events that will destroy the life he thought he had everything under control of. By the time the final consequence is revealed, it's clear he has become a puppet in a game he never anticipated. The penthouse is almost eerily quiet, save for the distant hum of the city far below. Outside, the lights flicker in the evening sky, while inside, there is no warmth, no comfort. The air feels thick, almost suffocating, and a silent battle of wills is taking place. The wife sits across from her husband at the dinner table, her expression unreadable, while he watches her closely. His voice is calm, but there's an underlying edge, a subtle but unmistakable command in the way he speaks. "I want you to understand why I'm doing this," he says, his eyes narrowing as he pushes the glass of wine toward her. His words are like a sharp knife, calculated and cold, and there's no room for argument. "This is not about you. It's about control, power, and you'll do it. For us." The wife's silence lingers like a dark cloud. She doesn't move to take the wine. Instead, she meets his gaze with a quiet intensity that makes him pause. She knows what's at stake, what he's asking of her, but something in her eyes says that she's already made a decision. She's no longer the woman he thought he could control. As he speaks again, the tension builds, but there's something different in the way he carries himself now. He's not as sure of himself as before. The more he tries to assert his power, the more he feels the subtle cracks in his plan. The game he thought was a sure win has already started to shift. But what if the game they are playing isn't just about control? His voice drops, almost to a whisper. What if it's about something far deeper than either of us ever imagined? In that moment, the world feels still. Everything hangs in the balance. The wife looks at him, the faintest hint of a smirk tugging at her lips. Her silence speaks volumes, and the subtle shift in her demeanor sends a chill down his spine. He doesn't understand it yet. He doesn't realize that the person sitting across from him is no longer the same woman who once begged for his approval. She doesn't speak, but there's something unsettling in her gaze. Something that tells him that the tables have already begun to turn, and by the time he realizes what's happening, it may already be too late. As the tension between them thickens, the camera pulls away, leaving the fate of their relationship suspended in the air. The stakes have never been higher, and the game they are about to play is one where there will be no winners, only consequences. Let's dive into the story. The penthouse was bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, its vast windows offering a panoramic view of the city below. The world outside hummed with energy, but inside, everything was still. Silence hung in the air like a thick, suffocating fog. The only sound breaking the quiet was the occasional clink of ice against crystal as a drink was refilled. The two figures at the dinner table seemed frozen in place, each one trapped in a private world of their own, separated by an invisible chasm. On one side sat the billionaire, his sharp, angular features betraying nothing of the emotional turmoil he felt beneath the surface. A man of power, influence, and control, he had always commanded the world around him with ease. But tonight, there was an unsettling edge to his confidence. A growing sense of unease gnawed at him, a feeling that something was slipping through his fingers. Across from him, his wife sat quietly. Her beauty was undeniable. But it was more than that. There was an aura around her, an inscrutable calm that only seemed to deepen with every passing moment. She was a woman who had long since mastered the art of concealment. And now, as she sat across from him, her stillness felt like a quiet defiance. Their relationship had always been complicated, built on a fragile foundation of power and expectation. For years, they had lived in a carefully constructed world, a world where control was everything. But now, things had started to shift. The facade that they had both carefully crafted for so long was beginning to crack. The billionaire stared at her, the tension palpable between them. His mind raced as he tried to hold onto the control he so desperately needed. He had pushed her into this situation, a test he believed would solidify his dominance. Yet, with each passing moment, he began to realize that he was no longer the one in control. She was slipping away from him, and the fear of losing everything started to bubble beneath his carefully constructed exterior. For the billionaire, the situation had become a battle, a war he was determined to win. His need for control had always been his driving force, but lately, he had begun to question if that control was slipping. Was she still the same woman who had once looked up to him with admiration, who had played the role of the dutiful wife? Or had she changed into something else, something that he couldn't understand? His gaze flicked to her once more, trying to read her expression, but it was no use. She was an enigma, her face a perfect mask of composure. Yet there was something in her eyes, a quiet fire that he had long ignored. He had always believed that he could mold her, shape her to fit his world. But now, with every passing moment, he realized that she was no longer his to control. For her part, the wife had long stopped trying to meet his expectations. She had once believed in their marriage, in the promises he had made, but those promises had turned hollow over the years. The man she had once trusted had become a stranger to her, a man whose power and arrogance had left a deep wound in her heart. She had given him everything, her love, her loyalty, her devotion, and in return, he had asked for more, always more. And now, he was pushing her into something she could no longer accept. The intimacy he demanded was a final straw, one that would shatter the illusion of their marriage once and for all. Her thoughts were clear now. She knew exactly what she wanted, but whether she had the strength to do it was another matter. But as she sat across from him, her resolve began to harden. She had once believed she was weak, trapped by her love for him. But now, she understood. She was no longer the woman he could manipulate. She was a force of her own, and she would not bow to his demands. The silence stretched on, growing heavier with each passing second. Finally, the billionaire's patience broke. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing, a cold edge creeping into his voice. "You've been silent long enough," he said, his tone sharp. "I've done everything for you. Everything. And this is how you repay me? By sitting there and doing nothing? I asked you a simple thing, a test of loyalty. It's not that hard." His words came out in a rush, frustration seeping through his controlled exterior. But the harder he pushed, the more distant she became. The grip he had once held on her, on everything, was slipping. The reality of the situation was becoming clear. He was no longer in charge. Not here. Not anymore. She met his gaze without flinching, her lips parting to speak. But for a moment, nothing came out. She was searching for the right words, words that would finally break the silence, words that would shatter the last remnants of their connection. And then, in a quiet, steady voice, she responded, "I don't want anything from you. You're the one who's lost everything." Her words hit him like a blow, each one heavier than the last. For a brief moment, the billionaire was stunned into silence. The weight of her response settled over him, and for the first time, he realized the gravity of the situation. She had already seen through him. She knew that the game he had been playing was nothing more than a facade. The power he thought he held had already begun to crumble, and she had become the one in control. The tension between them escalated. His breath quickened as he tried to regain control, but it was useless. She had turned the tables, and in doing so, had torn apart the last shred of their marriage. He was no longer the powerful man who had orchestrated this entire scenario. He was the one left exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't been in years. She remained calm, her words like a dagger that pierced through his fragile ego. His anger flared, but it wasn't enough. He was desperate to regain the upper hand, but she had already taken control. The game was no longer about power, it was about something much deeper, something that he couldn't control. The stakes had never been higher. The consequences of his actions were beginning to unfold in ways he couldn't yet understand. And the question remained, would he ever recover from the devastation he had set in motion? Or was this the beginning of the end for everything he had built? The game had begun, but the outcome was no longer in his hands. The days that followed the confrontation in the penthouse were tense and filled with a quiet kind of dread. In the grand, polished world they had created together, their marriage was now an uncomfortable, silent battlefield. Each moment spent in the same space only seemed to exacerbate the growing distance between them. The billionaire, once so confident in his ability to control everything around him, found himself shaken by a series of emotions he had long since suppressed. The reality of what he had demanded, the ultimate test of loyalty that had pushed his wife to the brink, was starting to gnaw at him. Each time he thought about the situation, his stomach twisted in a knot. It wasn't just her indifference that stung. It was the profound sense that he had lost something far more important than he had realized. His wife had always been an extension of his power, a reflection of his will. But now, she was something entirely different. The fear of losing her, of losing everything he had built, began to seep through the cracks in his carefully constructed facade. It started with small moments. The way she would look at him without speaking, as though she could see through him. The way she seemed so effortlessly distant, as if she were no longer interested in playing the role he had so meticulously crafted for her. At times, he would catch her eyes across a crowded room, and for a fleeting second, there was a look of quiet defiance. She was no longer the woman he could mold. She had become an enigma, something he couldn't control, and that terrified him. The billionaire's frustration grew with each passing day. He couldn't understand how things had shifted so quickly. He'd thought he had the upper hand, that by orchestrating this twisted scenario, he would reaffirm his dominance. Instead, he found himself questioning everything he had ever believed about power and control. The control he had so fiercely clung to was slipping away, and it felt as though there was nothing he could do to stop it. The breaking point came one evening in the study, where the tension had been building for days. He had tried, in vain, to reassert his authority, to push her into submission once again. But this time, his words were like knives, sharp, biting, but ineffective. She stood there, her back straight, her gaze unwavering, as he tried to tear her down with every insult, every accusation. But instead of crumbling under his pressure, she only seemed to grow stronger. "Why are you doing this?" he spat, the words dripping with contempt. "After everything I've given you, everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me? With this cold, distant silence? You think you can just walk away from this? You think you can?" Her response cut him off, her voice low and steady, but with an edge that sent a chill down his spine. "You think you know everything about me?" she challenged, her words laced with sarcasm. "You have no idea who I really am." His eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about? Who the hell do you think you are? You're nothing without me. I made you. I gave you everything you have." She laughed, but it wasn't a laugh of amusement. It was bitter, laced with years of resentment that had finally come to the surface. "Made me? You think you made me? You think I'm just some trophy you put on a shelf, a pawn in your little game? You've lost, haven't you? Because you didn't really understand what you were playing with. You've never understood me." For the first time in their entire marriage, he felt something break within him. Not just in their relationship, but within himself. She wasn't the helpless woman he had always assumed she was. She wasn't just the obedient wife who would bend to his every whim. She had her own power, and it had been there all along, simmering beneath the surface. And now, it was too late for him to take it back. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. In that moment, everything changed. He wasn't in control of the game. He wasn't the one who held all the cards. She had been playing him, manipulating him just as much as he had tried to manipulate her. The woman he had seen as a mere pawn in his game of power had become the queen. She had been quietly setting her own terms all along, and he had been blind to it. The sharp sting of betrayal, the realization that he had underestimated her, was almost too much to bear. His mind raced, his thoughts spinning wildly as he tried to comprehend the depth of what had just happened. How had he missed it? How had he failed to see the subtle signs? She wasn't just the woman who had been forced into his world. She had been biding her time, learning the game from the inside, until it was her turn to play. He had always believed that control was his. He had built an empire on the idea that he could dominate every aspect of his life, that everyone and everything was within his reach. But now, as he stood in front of her, he realized that he was the one who had been played all along. He had underestimated her strength, her intelligence, her resolve, and now it was too late to turn back. As the realization set in, the stakes grew higher. The game had spiraled far beyond anything he could have predicted. What had started as a simple test of loyalty had turned into something far more dangerous, something that threatened to unravel everything he had spent years building. The emotional and psychological toll on him was immense. He no longer knew who he was in this new reality. His wife, once his obedient partner, had become his adversary. The game had shifted, and now the danger was real. With each passing day, the tension between them grew. The billionaire's attempts to regain control only pushed her further away. The woman who had once been by his side, who had once been his greatest ally, was now his greatest threat. Every moment they spent in each other's presence only served to heighten the tension, the emotional distance growing wider and wider. It was clear now that there was no going back. But the billionaire wasn't ready to surrender just yet. He couldn't. The cost of losing this battle was too great. Everything he had built, everything he had worked for, was at risk. But as the stakes grew higher, so did the danger of losing it all. The consequences of his actions were beginning to unfold in ways he couldn't control, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he could win. The conflict had escalated beyond anything he could have imagined. What started as a test of power and control had now become a life-altering struggle. And as he faced the woman who had once been his greatest ally, he realized with a sinking feeling that he had underestimated the force he was up against. The game was no longer about control, it was about survival. The penthouse, once a symbol of their triumph, now felt like a prison. The luxurious decor, the sleek furniture, and the panoramic views of the city all seemed cold and distant. The billionaire sat in his study, his hands gripping the edge of his desk, eyes focused on the city below. Every flicker of light seemed to mock him. Every noise from the bustling streets below was a reminder of how far he had fallen from the empire he'd so carefully built. The past few weeks had been a blur of confusion and regret. He had always been the one in control, the one pulling the strings. But now, in the solitude of his study, he found himself consumed by doubt. He had pushed her too far. The consequences of his actions were too large to ignore now. And he was running out of time. The weight of what was coming pressed down on him, suffocating. The woman he had married, the woman who had been by his side through everything, was slipping from his grasp. She no longer sought his approval. She no longer needed him. And with every day that passed, he could feel her pulling away further. His control over her, and over everything, was slipping. She had become something different, something he couldn't understand. And then it happened. The thing he had feared most, the walls that had been closing in on him finally gave way. She walked into his study, her presence a quiet storm. Her eyes were cold, distant, but beneath that veneer, there was something he didn't recognize, something more than just anger. It was power. She stood there, facing him, and for a moment, neither spoke. The tension between them was palpable, as if the air itself had thickened with the weight of unspoken words. Without a word, she reached into her purse, pulling out a folded piece of paper. The billionaire's heart skipped a beat as he watched her approach him, her steps slow and deliberate. She placed the paper on the desk in front of him, and with an unreadable expression, she nodded toward it. "Read it," she said, her voice calm but laced with an undertone of something much deeper. He didn't move for a moment, unsure of what was happening. He wanted to ask, to demand an explanation, but the power in her eyes stopped him. Hesitantly, he unfolded the paper. The words on it hit him like a freight train. His name, his business, everything he had ever worked for, was laid out before him in a way he could never have expected. The document contained information, details, facts. It was a letter, one that seemed to be meant for him alone. The words were simple, direct. You think I'm just a woman from a bet, someone you could control, someone you could use for your own twisted games. But you've underestimated me. You've played the wrong hand. My father lost everything because of you. And now, it's time for you to pay for that. The bombshell dropped, and in that moment, the billionaire's world shattered. The air was sucked from the room. His heart raced as the weight of her words slammed into him. Everything he had ever believed was upended. His mind scrambled to process the reality of the situation. Her father, he remembered now, vaguely, a past event that had slipped into obscurity. He had made decisions, ruthless ones, in the pursuit of power, and her father had been one of the casualties. But he hadn't realized the depth of the damage. He hadn't realized she was tied to that pain. In an instant, it became clear to him she had been playing a far deeper game. She wasn't just a woman he had used to test loyalty. She had been biding her time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike back. And now, in this single moment, she had taken everything he had built and turned it against him. The billionaire stood frozen, his mind racing as the weight of her words began to sink in. Guilt flooded over him like a tidal wave. His thoughts swirled with the realization that he had been blind to her true power, her true purpose. For years, he had been playing a game, and he had thought he was winning. But now, as the pieces fell into place, he saw the truth. He had been the one who was played all along. The room spun. His chest tightened. He felt as though he couldn't breathe. Everything he had ever believed in, everything he had worked for, seemed to evaporate before him. It wasn't just the money, the power, the empire. It was his identity, his entire sense of control. He had built his life on the belief that he could manipulate everything and everyone around him. But in that moment, it was clear he couldn't control her. He never had. His eyes locked onto hers, and he saw no mercy there. The woman he had married, the woman he had forced into submission, was no longer the same. She had become something else, something dangerous, something far beyond his reach. She wasn't broken. She wasn't a victim. She was the one holding the power now. Everything between them shifted in that instant. The bond they had, if it had ever truly existed, was shattered. The foundation of their marriage had been built on manipulation and control, and now it was reduced to rubble. She had finally broken free, and in doing so, she had taken everything he had once held dear. She no longer needed him. She no longer sought his approval, his validation. She had her own purpose, her own power, and he was left in the ruins, unable to grasp the life he had once known. The billionaire opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. The years of control, the years of pushing her to do things she didn't want to do, everything that had once seemed so simple, now seemed like an insurmountable mountain. He had underestimated her. He had thought he could manipulate her into submission, but now he understood that she was the one who had been playing him all along. She didn't wait for him to speak. She didn't need his apologies, his promises. She had already moved beyond him, beyond his reach. She had found her own path, one that led her far away from the man he had once been. As she turned to leave, she didn't glance back. She didn't need to. He had already lost. And now, the consequences of his actions would haunt him forever. The tension in the room lingered, the silence hanging heavily in the air. It was the end of an era for the billionaire. The empire he had built, the power he had once wielded with such ease, was now nothing more than a distant memory. The woman who had been his greatest asset, his greatest pawn, had turned against him. And in doing so, she had claimed victory. The once vibrant penthouse, now void of warmth and comfort, had become a graveyard for his empire. The city lights outside no longer sparkled with ambition, they merely mocked his fall. He could feel it in the air, the suffocating silence that settled between them. His every breath was heavy with regret, his every glance toward her laced with disbelief. He had believed himself untouchable, that his wealth, his power, could make anyone bend to his will. But now, the house that once stood as a monument to his success felt like a crumbling shell. His fingers, still accustomed to the cold touch of power, gripped the arms of his chair with desperation. His mind, once sharp and calculating, now swirled with thoughts he couldn't control. She had taken everything from him, and yet she had done it in a way he couldn't understand, a way that, despite his deepest instincts, left him hollow and uncertain. The days that followed the revelation were a blur of torment for the billionaire. Every day, every hour, felt like a battle between the man he once was and the broken, desperate figure he had become. The guilt gnawed at him incessantly, a constant, creeping weight that he couldn't shake off. He tried to ignore it, tried to bury it beneath work, beneath distractions, but it always found a way to resurface. Every time he passed her in the house, he saw it, the cool indifference in her eyes, the way she no longer sought his approval, no longer catered to his desires. She was a stranger now, someone beyond his reach. The woman who had once been his, who had once been vulnerable to his manipulation, was now untouchable, a force in her own right. And that was the source of his torment. He had pushed her into this game, convinced that he was the one in control. But now, as he watched her walk through the house with the same detached calmness, he couldn't escape the truth. She had never been the pawn he thought she was. She had simply been waiting for him to make the wrong move, and when he did, she had struck with the precision of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The nights were the hardest. Alone in their bed, he could feel the space between them grow. There was no longer the comfort of her presence, no longer the safety of her touch. He slept fitfully, tossing and turning, haunted by the images of what had transpired. His mind would replay it over and over again, the way she had stood in front of him, the coldness in her eyes, the moment when he realized how deeply he had underestimated her. And then, he would see the man, the one who had taken what was his, the man who, in his mind, had become the symbol of his humiliation. He saw his face in his nightmares, heard his laughter echoing in his ears. But the real torment, the one that kept him awake at night, wasn't the man himself. It was the realization that his wife had done this. She had willingly shared herself with him. Not because she was forced, not because she had no choice, but because she had chosen to. She had chosen to hurt him in the way he had hurt others. The billionaire's world, once firmly anchored by his wealth and influence, began to unravel before his eyes. He couldn't focus at work. His once sharp instincts, honed over decades of ruthless decisions, now failed him. Every business deal he entered into seemed to go awry. Investors who once flocked to him now pulled back, hesitant and uncertain. His own board of directors, once loyal, began to question his decisions. His power, which had once been absolute, had started to slip through his fingers like sand. The stress mounted. It wasn't just the loss of money, it was the loss of the control he had built his entire life upon. His authority was slipping away, and with it, his sense of self. He began to lash out at those around him, his employees, his colleagues, anyone who dared to challenge him. But the more he pushed, the more he lost. His empire, the one he had spent decades building, was beginning to fall apart. At home, the damage was even more apparent. The house that had once been a sanctuary now felt like a battlefield. He could no longer speak to his wife without feeling the gulf between them. He could no longer pretend that everything was fine, that they could move past the damage he had caused. The very foundation of their relationship had been shattered, and there was no rebuilding it. As the days turned into weeks, it became increasingly clear that she was in control. He had given her the tools to destroy him, and now she was using them with methodical precision. She no longer played by his rules. She had rewritten the game entirely, and he was left scrambling, trying to catch up. Her actions were subtle, but devastating. She had no need for grand gestures or declarations. She simply moved with the quiet confidence of someone who knew their power, someone who was content to watch everything fall apart. She controlled the narrative now. She didn't need to speak to him, didn't need to justify herself. She had taken her revenge, and in doing so, she had claimed something far more powerful than any material possession, control over him. Her influence seeped into every corner of his life. She didn't have to say a word. Her mere presence was enough to remind him of his failures. When she walked into a room, everyone turned to her. When she spoke, people listened. She had become a force in her own right, someone who no longer needed him to validate her existence. The roles had been reversed. He had once been the one everyone turned to, the one whose decisions shaped the world around him. Now, it was her that commanded attention, and he was powerless to stop it. As the cracks in his world deepened, the billionaire's desperation grew. He tried everything. He apologized. He begged. He promised that things would change. He tried to rekindle the passion they had once shared, to remind her of the life they had built together. But nothing got through. She no longer cared. She had seen through his manipulations. She no longer needed his promises, his words. He had become nothing more than a shadow of the man he once was, a man broken by his own arrogance, a man who had pushed too far and lost everything. One night, as he stood in front of her, his voice trembling with the weight of his own failure, he realized the truth. He couldn't win her back. Not with words, not with apologies. She was no longer the woman he had once controlled. She had become something else. She was stronger, wiser, and more dangerous than he had ever realized. And in that moment, he understood. He had destroyed everything. His empire, his marriage, his sense of self, by pushing too far, by trying to control something that couldn't be controlled. The consequences of his actions were irreversible. And now, there was no turning back. The penthouse had never felt so cold. The city lights outside seemed distant, as though they belonged to a different world entirely. Inside, the tension between them was suffocating. The silence was heavy, laden with the weight of everything that had happened. He stood by the window, staring out at the darkened skyline, his mind spiraling with thoughts he couldn't escape. He had pushed her too far, and now, the consequences of his actions were beginning to settle in like a cold, unavoidable truth. She stood at the other end of the room, calm, composed, almost too serene. It was as if she had accepted something that he still couldn't bring himself to understand. She was no longer the woman he could control, the woman who would bow to his demands. She was something else now, something more powerful, more dangerous than he had ever anticipated. He could feel it in the way she looked at him, the way her silence spoke volumes. It was this moment, this final confrontation, that would decide everything. He couldn't run from it anymore. He couldn't hide behind his wealth, his power, or his bravado. Everything he had built, everything he had manipulated to secure his dominance, had crumbled. And now, he had to face the woman who had become the most formidable opponent of all. Why? His voice cracked as he turned to face her, the question hanging in the air like a challenge, a demand for an answer that he knew would be the final blow. She didn't respond immediately. She simply looked at him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, it felt like time stood still, like everything around them had been suspended, as if the world itself was holding its breath. He took a step forward, his desperation growing. "You took everything from me. Everything I've ever worked for. Why? Why did you do it?" She remained silent, her eyes cold and calculating. Then, slowly, deliberately, she spoke. "Because you made me." Her voice was calm, almost too calm, as if she had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in her mind. "You pushed me into this. You thought you could control me, manipulate me. But what you didn't realize was that I was never the one who was weak." His heart pounded in his chest, each word a blow to his pride, to the image of himself he had so carefully constructed. The facade of the untouchable billionaire, the man who controlled everything. She had torn it down piece by piece, and now there was nothing left. "Do you even understand what you've done?" His voice rose, raw with emotion. "I'm not the man I used to be. I can't even look at myself anymore. And you did this to me. You humiliated me." She took a step toward him, her presence overwhelming. "I didn't humiliate you. You humiliated yourself. You pushed me into something I never wanted, and now you're too weak to accept the consequences." The words cut through him like a blade. She was right. She had never needed to destroy him in the way he had feared. She hadn't used force, hadn't fought him physically. She had simply allowed him to expose himself for the man he truly was, a man who thought he could control everything, a man who had underestimated the woman he had married. The tension in the room reached its breaking point. His mind raced, but there were no more words left to say. He had nothing left to bargain with, nothing left to offer. He had pushed her too far, and now he had to face the price of his arrogance. As she stood there, looking at him, He realized that everything he had fought for, everything he had believed in, had been a lie. He had built his empire on manipulation and control, thinking that power could solve everything. But power hadn't saved him. It hadn't saved his marriage. And now, it was too late. "I never wanted this," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The regret he had been holding back for so long came rushing to the surface, drowning him in its weight. "I never wanted to hurt you." Her expression softened for a brief moment, but only for a fleeting second. She had already moved past the point of forgiveness. "You did hurt me," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "And now, I'm done. There's nothing left for me here. Nothing left for us." The finality of her words hit him like a physical blow. There was no going back. The man who had once stood at the top of the world, untouchable, was now a hollow shell of who he had been. His wealth, his success, his control, none of it mattered. It had all crumbled under the weight of his own actions. He had lost everything that had once defined him, and there was no redemption, no way to rebuild what was lost. He sank to his knees, his hands clutching his head as the full extent of his destruction washed over him. She didn't speak anymore. She didn't need to. Her silence was the final verdict. She had taken control, and there was no power left in him to fight back. As he knelt there, broken and defeated, the reality of what he had become settled in. The man he had been, the confident, powerful billionaire who controlled everything, was gone. In his place was a man who had lost his marriage, his empire, and his sense of self. His greed, his arrogance, his need for control had all led him down this path, and now there was no escape. He thought back to the beginning of it all, the bet, the manipulation, the way he had convinced himself that he was untouchable. He had been so certain that he could control everything, that no one could touch him. But in the end, it wasn't his wealth or his power that had been his downfall. It was his inability to see the truth, to see the woman he had married, the one he had underestimated, as more than just a tool to be used. The woman who had once been his possession had become his reckoning. And now, in the ruins of everything he had built, he was left to pick up the pieces of a life that could never be repaired. He had destroyed her trust. He had broken her heart. And in doing so, he had broken himself. The reality was crushing, but there was no escaping it. The consequences of his actions had been devastating, and they would haunt him for the rest of his life. Closure of the story. The story that began as a dangerous game of control and manipulation has now come to a devastating end. The billionaire, once at the top of his game, believing himself to be untouchable, found himself dismantled by his own actions. He pushed his wife to a point beyond reconciliation, forcing her into an affair that shattered everything they had built together. But in the end, it wasn't just the marriage that was destroyed, it was the very foundation of his empire, his sense of power, and his identity. What started as a calculated move, a way to exert dominance, turned into a nightmare of regret and loss. The desire for control can be intoxicating, but as this story illustrates, it comes with a price that can be far more than one is willing to pay. In the aftermath, the billionaire is left alone, facing the ruins of his life. And as the dust settles, the question lingers, will he ever recover? Can someone who has lost everything truly rebuild? Or is he forever condemned to live with the consequences of his greed and arrogance? The moral of the story is clear. Power, control, and manipulation might give the illusion of victory, but the real cost is far too high. The scars left by betrayal and selfishness are deep, and they may never heal. Now that you've seen the devastating consequences of this twisted tale, what do you think? Do you believe that someone like him can ever change, or is he doomed to live with the guilt of his actions forever? Could he ever find redemption, or was this the point of no return for him? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think about the choices these characters made and how they shaped their destinies. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more stories like this one, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us bring more thought-provoking content your way. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.